Hello and welcome to the Ori Spotlight Podcast. This week, our guest is John Khoury, founder of Project Farma. And John, you have the distinction of being the second person from Project Farma to join us. You're the repeat offenders. We had Anshul on, as you know, maybe a year ago now, but we're excited to hear what you got to say on the latest and greatest around cell and gene. And also, I'm sure you'll be a much better guest than Anshul was. So I'm excited for that too.
Well, I mean, it sounds like we're doing a great job here of working with you, Jason. We love talking to you, and second time's the best time. This is going to be the one time the sequel's better than the prequel.
Awesome. Well, let's get going, and if we can, introduce the listeners to you and your background. You founded the business there, and you've got a history of entrepreneurship, investment, and certainly close to advanced therapy manufacturing, which, as you know, is our core focus on this podcast. Love to hear more about kind of your career journey and how you ended up founding Project Pharma.
So my background's mechanical engineering. Transparently, I'd wanted to become a doctor, but all that education was going to take a bit more time than I had with my humble beginnings to put in. And ultimately, as advanced therapies were coming to a forefront, we saw an opportunity where they needed more engineering minds and more entrepreneurial minds to solve these complex problems. At that point, in talking to Anshul and Tony Corey, um, we just were like, there's got to be a better model here of not just being, a staffing company, but actually a high-powered project delivery team to solve these complex challenges. And in that, we started talking about what we wanted to be, and we wanted to be like our partners. We wanted to be patient focused. Also, as our product is our people, so we wanted to be people first. And with those two words and phrases, we became Project Pharma, and it's been a very proud thing to work with the biggest blockbusters that have ultimately gained approval at this point and hopefully continuing to move this field forward.
John, I think it was probably 4 or 5 years ago we met each other, and Project
Yeah, it's been
Pharma
a
is
bit.
one of. I mean, it seems like forever ago now. I was new to Ori, yeah, 2019, I think. And you guys were one of the largest service providers to the advanced therapies industry. And just tell, if you can, any of, and probably still are, tell whoever's listening kind of what Project Pharma does in detail.
In the early stages of Project Farma, our strategy group, led by Tony Corey, Danny Foodie, and myself, was heavily focused on high impact strategic decision making. A major part of our work centered around make versus buy business cases, determining whether organizations should manufacture internally or partner with external CDMOs. These were pivotal decisions occurring at critical points in the investment cycle. And many of those proposals that we developed ultimately went before boards that funded significant industry shaping programs. At the same time, the regulatory and operational frameworks that exist in traditional biologics were still developing advanced therapies, requiring us to shift from simply relying on our past experience to thoughtfully adapting it, balancing those proven principles with the flexibility needed for an emerging modality. It was clear that a traditional biologics based cookie cutter approach wasn't going to work here. Our regulators have also acknowledged this. The modality does not fit neatly within existing regulatory structures as both the science and manufacturing continue to evolve. This need for adaptability became a defining element of Project Pharma's value, strengthening our long term partnerships and prompting a broader question. How do we design environments that maintain compliance while enabling the level of innovation required to bring life changing, life saving therapies to patients? In the end, we had the privilege of supporting several emerging advanced therapy innovators whose platforms later achieved commercial breakthrough status. It was an inflection point not only for the sector, but for our team as well, as we helped guide foundational decisions and support the build out of some of the largest advanced therapy manufacturing footprints in the industry. It remains a really proud chapter for us, driven by our desire to just help solve complex problems for the patients in this rapidly evolving field.
Yeah, I think over the last 5 or 6 years, we've realized like a cookie cutter approach from what we did in biologics to advanced therapies doesn't work that well and isn't the right approach, but we've sort of nuanced it based on what we've learned over 20 or 30 years of biologics manufacturing.
100%. Even the regulators have identified that. They've said, there's a, it's not surprising that we don't fit in the regulatory framework. So everybody's saying kind of the same thing is this is different, complicated, and the outcomes are unique. And our manufacturing processes are evolving in that same cycle. So how do we build an environment that does allow for more innovation than we're typically accustomed to?
Yeah,
And that's the only way to bring these life-changing, life-saving medicines to market.
I mean, you talked about that buy and build decision that companies were making back in 19, 20, 21. Given the changes in the macro environment and the funding environment for companies, how has the considerations changed around that decision?
I think we're doing less make versus buys and more buy versus buy assessments and kind of working in what's the best partner for you. I mean,
Yeah,
it's crazy to think, Jason, since we started Project Farma back in 2016, that here we are almost 10 years later, um, that the whole funding environment has changed. And I think we need to get more comfortable with the current funding environment. Not the current funding environment, but rather the current macroeconomics that we see around us.
yeah,
Interest rates aren't going to go down to zero again or very low numbers. Um, we're going to live through volatile economic times. We see that every day. We read the paper and, you know, this is up, this is down, interest rates, are they going to be changed or not? And I think we just need to get more comfortable that that is a constant, is that we're going to see some volatility. So, what is the line that we can put down the middle to set a course that's going to drive a lot of these next generation treatments? Because if the funding environment is going to be contingent on the macroeconomic environment, and we know the macroeconomic environment is going to be volatile, then that's now a constant in our equation. And I think we see behaviors today that really mirror that, um, where, I was just looking over some of the statistics around the investment environment. Um, we're seeing lower investment. I think we've all seen that, and it's not
mhm,
raw earth shattering, but we're seeing higher average dollars per deal with
mhm.
less deals. So it's almost like just like we're doing in terms of precision medicine, it's almost like precision investing right now to reduce the risk based on the macro environment where the funding is a little bit more restrictive.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the new normal that we're kind of reaching is, a little bit less spray and pray, a little more targeted, a little more laser focused. I mean, pretty much everything that with a business plan was getting funded back in the day. I think $50 billion of investment went into cell and gene in 2020 and 2021 alone, which is a ridiculous amount of money, and has really jump started some of this next evolution we're seeing. But there's been a flight to quality. I agree. Fewer deals. Companies raising more money. Um, and the interesting kind of, I think, realization, at least that I've had, and I hear kind of industry participants talking about, is that old biotech playbook, the one where we sort of develop a product and we get some first in man, we get some clinical data, and then we flip it to one of the big pharma companies because they're going to worry about manufacturing. They've got that sorted. We don't need to worry about that. We just need to worry about the science. And that playbook is being rewritten as we speak for what I'm calling CGT 2.0. I think we tried to follow that model in 20, 21, 22, 23, and we realized that it doesn't work. It doesn't work for advanced therapies. We need to understand not only the biological, clinical, scientific characteristics of our product, but also the commercial ones. How are we going to manufacture this at scale? What is our cost of goods profile going to look like? How many patients do we want to treat? What line of therapy are we intended to be used at? And some of those questions that should get answered preclinically, in the TPP formation stage, we were looking at our target product profile, weren't getting answered. And so they would just make a product that at any cost of goods, assuming they could cost whatever they wanted, charge whatever they wanted. But then they found they couldn't make enough of it. They couldn't get covered in the line of therapy that they wanted, and that led to, I think, some of the challenges we've seen with some of the pioneers in the space. It was sad to see kind of Adaptimmune, get sold with one approved product and two in the sort of late stage or early clinical phase, because that product just wasn't getting the traction to support their pipeline. Similar story with Bluebird, although that's now having a renaissance, hopefully. But some of these companies have really struggled to make profitable their first products. I mean, I just saw in the last week or so, J&J reported out that, or J&J Legend reported out that Carvicti is going to be close to a $2 billion product this year. And that's top line revenue, which is incredible. And that means somewhere close to probably 4 or 5 thousand patients, multiple myeloma patients, will have gotten treated with that therapy, which is awesome. That's like double year over year, and that therapy has second line approval. But the underlying economics, cost of goods are still high, still too high. Throughput's still too low for even for those giant players that are at scale. So how has the kind of playbook shifted in your mind? Where does the discussion around commercial viability come in? Because it's really we're hearing it more and more preclinical.
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that question. One is the investment, right? You mentioned spray and pray, right? We had one key indication. We acquired a breadbasket of options that this platform, which can be used as a dirty word and an exciting word, um, can ultimately get to. And I think that investment environment is different than the one we're at today.
Certainly.
Now, the second part of what you were talking about is how do we solve those challenges around cost, around manufacturability, around consistency? And I almost think that the investment environment over the last 2, 3 years has given us time to think about that answer more thoroughly, um, and look at it through a different lens because there's a multiple set of ways to solve those issues. And we can dive into those as we discuss, whether that's automation, whether that's shorter cycle times, whether that's in vivo, ex vivo, allogeneic versus autologous. The problem is being solved in a lot of different approaches. And I think time in terms of maturity of thought has been good for us. I think time in terms of advancement of science has not been as good because it's slowed down the investment on these life-changing, life-saving medicines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you may have seen that we had recently received advanced manufacturing technology designation from the FDA for our Eero platform. And one of the rationales, as we understand it, by the agency to even create the designation was to make it easier for therapy developers to engage with technologies that can help solve some of these issues earlier in the development and or switch off of more kind of lab scale tools, flasks and bags and maybe old automation onto something that is fit for purpose. And that I think ultimately the FDA is equally frustrated that not as many patients are getting treated. They work really hard to get a products approved and work with sponsors to get these products through clinical trials and onto the market. And, all told last year, we treated 10,300 patients as an industry, roughly, globally. And I think that represents less than 5% of the global patient population. So it's that kind of, how do you coach your early stage customers that are maybe preclinical? They're thinking about this maybe buy or buy decision. They're thinking about how they get a robust process that can get into the clinic and then be scalable. What are some of the common pitfalls that you see people making and the advice that you give to early clients?
Well, first, huge congratulations to you and the whole Ori Biotech team on that designation. I think that designation is so helpful because when we were working with preclinical, even clinical one advanced therapies, you have this change in mentality that needs to occur. And as I've been successful in entrepreneurship, you need to identify what's great about each role or individual in your organization and empower them. But there's a crux, there's a transition period there in the middle where we go from a scientist to how do I manufacture at cost and scale? And those are two different people. That's an engineer talking to an artist, an educated artist at that. I don't want to
Yes.
downplay that, but it's an artist.
Hmm.
And I think the breakthrough designation allows the artist now to look at that as a great paintbrush in their tool set that they can say, okay, I'm accustomed to flags and flasks and bags. I'm accustomed to working under a BSc, but I've got this breakthrough designation on this equipment that could be a platform that now removes that conversation, that hard conversation between the developer and the scientist and the manufacturer that seems to go sideways. It's always
Yeah.
been a hard conversation for us, to be honest with you.
Sure.
Even when we're doing our make versus buy business cases, and I'm talking to a doctor and going, here's how much it's going to cost over the next 10 years to build your manufacturing and your commercial organizations. And they look back and go, no way, that should cost a quarter of what you just said, John.
Right.
Right? It's just that their specialty is not in that side of the business.
Yep.
And ultimately, the best partnerships come when they can respect that the commercial expertise, commercial manufacturer, et cetera, while we respect the commercial or the development processes that they go through. And I think this platform, again, to say it, is is really providing, hopefully, an easier identification for our developers to say, hey, let's start with this. The FDA respects this, has established it as it will make a repeatable process, which is what we want in the first place. It'll drive consistent results, which takes a lot of risk out of our um, process development activities, and it's going to easily transition into commercial operation to a viable model. I think that that bridge is super exciting, and again, congratulations.
No, I think that's a great assessment of the of the status quo and the conversations that we're having every day. Getting kind of research teams or development teams, translational teams to think about ultimately scalability, cost of goods, commercial throughput. It's just not what they do. It's not something they've had to be thinking about very frequently in the past, and often, as you said, those organizations, parts of the organization, are siloed from one another. So when the technical operations team or the brand team or the commercial team is looking at the product that's coming out of the process, they're like, oh no, what are we what are we going to do with this? And so it's too late at that point. When you get to late clinical, certainly. What's your opinion on how late is too late to address some of these things? I've asked many stakeholders this question. Usually, it narrows in about the same place, but I'm curious what your view is. If you're thinking about commercial viability and scalability, when is it too late to try to make any changes to the process?
I'm a I believe the only thing constant is change, and we need to get more comfortable with change. But
Yep.
we've got to have a framework that allows us not to continue to, um, try new things. So I look at what I'd like to see is early implementation of automation platforms into the development process. Now, I think that has to be done early and quickly. Um,
Agreed.
the actual final decision, I think, can evolve as long as you can run multiple process development activities to ultimately come to the CPP, CQAs that you need for your drug product. And you can then use the equipment to optimize your drug onto that platform. And
Yep.
so I look at it as more of, there's not a too late. I mean, ultimately, when you need to manufacture at commercial scale, call it your clinical two timelines,
Hmm.
um, you kind of have to lock this thing down pretty good.
Yep.
Um, but that means that we need to, there's no too early in terms of assessing and implementing, and even partnering with a equipment manufacturer and partner that
Hmm.
will ultimately drive a long term cost of goods and successful reproduction, recreation of your drug product.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we encourage as early as possible when we talk to developers. I think probably pivotal is too late, but anytime before there we can help, and even commercial. Like the perceived bar for to change something in the manufacturing process of a commercial product is very high. The perception of that is very high. But I also have seen some indications from the regulator to say ultimately we care about safety and efficacy. If you can demonstrate to us a more advanced process or a parallel process that's automated can deliver on the CQAs, can deliver a safe and effective product, then they're willing to take a look at how that gets proven, maybe even in a phase 4 post marketing study, rather than having anything that takes you back into the clinic as a non-starter. So it would have to be some sort of a small comparability study. But ultimately, I think that bar is coming down because, as we said, the FDA wants to see there's no reason for us to be using technologies that are 20 years old in products that are in the market, because you're not going to get the benefits of the latest thinking and of the latest generation of technology. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I guess in thinking that through, are the regulators really the roadblocks right now? Or are they actually giving us freedom to say, hey, build a case and we'll assess it and analyze it? But I think that the higher the drug price is, I'm seeing it more on the commercial end affecting the decisions made by oncologists, especially on when there is a status quo or a proven line one treatment for a disease is okay. Should I even assess this thing that's at 350 to 500,000 or 750 or 2 million or
Yeah.
whatever that top line is?
Hmm.
How does that impact the healthcare system when I know I've got a line one treatment that's here? I was talking to some family recently. I was interviewing, I just moved to New Jersey and I was interviewing different primary care physicians. And 3 out of the 5 primary care physicians that I spoke to um, didn't know what CAR T therapy really was off the top of their head.
That's
Granted, they're
not
not
surprising.
oncologists, they're not dealing
Yeah.
with these diseases on the day to day, but
Yep.
as somebody who works in advanced therapy, if my primary care physician doesn't know the options, that's my partner in my life's journey. So how do I have a dialogue if they aren't familiar with what I believe is some of the cutting edge personalized treatment out there, and that we have proven science that's going to advance this? Now, granted, that's just mine. I could have called the wrong phone book, but then again, I don't think that's off base with what we're seeing in the actual treatment centers with the percentage of patients that are eligible to be treated. So, it's a very unique environment. So, I don't think the regulators are actually the challenge right now, as much as the high drug price is almost making the physicians at the end, well, am I willing to transfer this physician? Do I have results, or this patient? Do I have results that really drive that? Um, this is a very high cost, high risk. What's the pay or payee model? And all these other downstream items around commercial viability that the regulators aren't necessarily concerned about. They're more concerned in the health of the safety profile, the cytotoxicity, et cetera. Or I think it's actually affecting the commercial viability of those discussions. And it's an indirect input there, right? Is like,
Yeah.
oh, if our house costs X, I'm not even looking at it. I can't
Right.
afford it, or the patient can't afford it. Why would I put my family in that dialogue? And I think that's where actually the challenge is being had. But um, I do believe if we want better results and easier regulatory pathways, which would speed up the time, which would decrease overall investment, which would ultimately decrease cost, we've got to work with our regulators better. But I think if we don't drive down costs, we're the commercial viability component is actually what's being impacted, not the regulatory.
Yeah, you hit on a couple super interesting and critical issues in that segment. Just to say, I agree with you. I don't think the regulator is the barrier there to modernizing, shall we say, manufacturing processes. I think it's the perception of the teams within the companies that have products on the market to say, "Oh no, it's too hard. It's the barrier is too high. The agency's not going to let us. The FDA is going to, put us through the ringer." It because historically making any changes has been difficult. But I think in this field at this time, the regulator is very open to improving, as you said, standardization. We have out of spec rates that range up to potentially 20%. I mean, we've never seen that in GMP manufacturing before. So we want to get out of specs down. We want to get consistency up. We want to get COGS down. We want to get throughput up. And the agency is interested in helping sponsors do that. So I think it's the perceived bar, not the actual bar, being quite high that prevents people from thinking about modernizing that process. That's point one. Point two on the cost side, I always get sort of, when people are we're having a spirited debate about these types of issues, they say, well, manufacturing and COGS has nothing to do with price. And I'll say that's true. However, if manufacturers are able to make more margin, that gives them more flexibility on price. That gives them more flexibility to contract, in various ways to open up access and for earlier lines of coverage. So more profit in the system, which is now very thin, is a good thing. And what does impact price is competition. The more products we can get approved in multiple indications, it's just the natural. I've worked in biopharma for 25 years. This is what happens, right? The innovator, the first mover, has pricing power, and the next one that comes in, then there begins a market share battle. That's just the way it works. So long as we can serve, a large proportion of the market. So these things, actually, Ying, the CEO of Legend, he did an interesting interview with Biotech TV where he said, so in their Carditude 4 trial, they were paying for both the standard of care comparator arm as well as the Carvicti arm, and they had access to claims data for both of those subsegments of the patient population that was being studied. The standard of care arm, the standard 3 drug cocktail for a multiple myeloma patient at that stage, was the cost was $1.6 million. The cost for Carvicti was 700,000. So actually, the perception is the headline, the sticker price sounds high for these advanced therapies. But when you dig into all the things that go into treatment for the first or second line of therapies, actually these products are quite cost effective. And I posted this to my LinkedIn if you're interested. It's a super interesting segment where he just, really, because they had access to that claims data. The other thing that he said, which is super interesting, is they're doing 60% of their dosing in the community. So they're starting to move away from only in specialist centers, opening up access in community cancer hospitals. And I think all of these are very positive trends that we see kind of to help open up access for patients.
Yeah, I think to that point on that Carvicti assessment, it's that perception of that large down payment, that upfront, and then the
Upfront cost.
unknown
Yeah.
maintenance costs.
Hmm.
And this is where, like, I hope we can use AI models or we can bring this data to the forefront because it is a significant savings over the current standard of care over the time period, which is going to decrease the pressure on our healthcare system. But because of that initial price tag, people are they automatically
Yeah, they kind of block it out. Or like it
they
just
block it out. It's
goes into a
just
different space, different
there's
headspace. Yeah.
no
Yeah.
way that is accurate. If you 750 grams is what there's no way that is accurate. There's some flawed assumption in there. But that's where I hope we can use AI or use something to help people realize this is the hard cash that's coming from our healthcare system
Yeah.
towards these patients. And that's the financial burden. Let's talk about the quality of life burden for the patient.
That's right.
But if I can get a single treatment, I know I'm going to go through some things, but I can live a more normalized life, and I'll give anything for those extra few years. It's I had my best friend pass away last year at 44 um,
I
for
remember you telling me.
hepatocellular carcinoma, and I think I mentioned that to you when we were at JPM
Hmm.
last year. It hit me. I mean that was 3 months, 3.5 months battle that came out of nowhere,
Yeah.
right? And we have hopefully some pipeline drugs that will change that outcome, and that cost on the healthcare, that burden. There's a quality of life component that I think we could all look at each other as a human being
Yeah.
and go, yeah, there's no price tag that I wouldn't put on that. It's just how do we educate the end user, the prescriber better, uh, and what would help them have more belief in those items.
One other statistic that I recently read, so you might know Joe DePinto at McKesson. He's been on the podcast. They put out a report last week. They do kind of a prescriber, payer, provider interview series every year to kind of, you know, just assess the stage of where the kind of advanced therapies industry is. One of the statistics that jumped off the page at me about last week's report was 66% of community oncologists thought that CAR T therapy was too risky, quote unquote, for their patients. Um, and when you highlight the lack of awareness at the GP level, these are oncologists, community oncologists, not the kind of academic medical center oncologists, but I think there's a massive educational effort that needs to happen about the state of where these therapies are, the incredible evidence base that they have, the 10-year track record that we've built to say these products are safe, these products are effective, they're actually also cost effective and can be delivered in the community. And we need to find a way to break through some of those perceptions that currently exist or misperceptions.
And this aligns with all the data that we're seeing around only 2 out of 10 eligible patients are actually getting these treatments, right?
Yeah.
There's 8 patients. And when I hear dialogue around, well, those are in, certain geographies that we can't reach, that can't be all 8. I mean, we're not 80% of Americans don't live in rural geographies that don't have access
Yeah.
to a treatment center. So there's other impediments that I think education could really break through. And I like I'm hoping ideas like what we saw on the outcome, like what we saw in the voluntary run, the CMS Innovation Center, the outcomes based agreements, that at least removes that cost roadblock, right? Like I like to think of it as, different barriers that we're gonna have to knock down with these oncologists, right? One is what you just described. Is it effective? Two is cost. Three, we could go down a list. And I think if we could move to more, especially on the newer drugs, outcome-based agreements, at least it opens a door to then ensure that if it's successful and we're taking care of patients, that commercial drug will create a successful company and financial benefit to the organization, but also successful outcomes to the patients versus having cost be a roadblock to prescription.
No, 100% agree, and earlier line of therapy because I think we have a little bit in the U.S. especially we suffer from a left pocket right pocket problem, right? So payers look only in one pocket at the prescription benefit. They don't look at the medical benefits. They don't actually know the whole cost of the standard of care. And so, as you said, $700,000 looks expensive. Like, why would I pay that? When you're maybe even paying more out of both pockets.
I do a lot. My leadership training is around, head, that data and analytics, the heart, and the guts, the experience. And I think your head is that money component, right?
Mhm.
But my heart looks at the human being, going, what is their quality of life going to look like? And then my gut, my experience says, if we get better patient outcomes, there will be profit, and ultimately we'll have a better society. So I think I think we're going to see more positive outcomes as the funding environment changes, but we've got to work on that commercial dialogue so that people really understand the benefits here, not just from a dollars and cents, but from the human aspect. 'Cause I think that may unblock things also. I do want to go back to something you talked about regarding perception on regulation. I know we've been talking a little bit on the commercial sector,
Yeah.
but I love that you said it's perception on the regulatory outcomes. The number of rooms I've sat in that have said, there's I don't believe the regulators will agree with this. And I like to ask the question back of, what don't you think they're going to agree with,
Hmm.
right? And really kind of try to open this dialogue up to, instead of, well, at my experience at company A, well, this isn't company, let's break that down.
That's
What
right.
did company A have in terms of subcomponents that would make a regulator say no to that? Right? And when you have a biologics process with consistent inputs, with consistent manufacturing processes, wanting some flexibility around Part 11 compliance makes no sense. There's no reason, there's no impediment in the development or the manufacturing process that makes you need that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when we're talking about CAR T, whether it's autologous or allogeneic, when we're talking about in vivo or ex vivo or hybrid, there is so much change happening that I think it's more of, let's have a dialogue around what are the risks here, because we've got patients in need and we've got assets that aren't being developed. And ultimately, if we can target those dialogues to against our perception, but more around a learning mentality, right? Let's learn together to advance something. Entrepreneurship, or this idea of doing something totally unique, doesn't come without risk. And if we want to take the risk down to zero, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great insight. We actually had a Type D meeting with a sponsor last year. And we had kind of a side bet to say, like, is their advice to be to start the clinical trial over? And they were in phase 1, 2, or do they think we can proceed with a parallel process? And actually, it was the latter. The agency said, if you can show that it's a comparable process, that you're delivering the same CQAs, the same release criteria for your existing, IND set or has set forward, then you run the two in parallel. You show that the parallel process can deliver those, and that it's safe and effective to treat patients, and then you can merge the two data sets, so you don't have to go backwards. You can look forwards, and that was a great, sort of, I would say, indicator of what you just said, which is the agency isn't stuck in the past. Why should we be? Why should our regulatory point of view or our quality point of view be stuck in 10 years ago in biologics, or 20 years ago in small molecules? We need a forward-looking view that has innovation and that takes into account some of the unique aspects of advanced therapies.
Well, and I think they recognize there's no way to reach our true north. Let's say the gold standard is biologics
Hmm.
manufacturing. How do you get there from a beaker if we don't allow for comparability or other development activities to happen in parallel? Granted, there's risk, but how do we assess those risks? Because a change is better than no change. And I think that not only applies to what's best short term in terms of profit and loss, but it's also what's best long term, because there's going to be another developer who's going to be on a platform who's going to have automation and more consistent results. And ultimately, you're going to lose market share across the table on a more repeatable with less out of spec activities, et cetera. And
Yep.
either we allow these organizations to evolve or a new organization is going to come in. And this is where it's, I'm if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a question. Because I feel like the larger an organization gets and the moment they have commercial drug product, it becomes challenging to innovate.
Yeah.
Um, so are you seeing the same thing? Because it's making me wonder, are the breakthroughs going to come in the next private equity invested organizations, or are the breakthroughs going to come from all this investment that we're seeing by large pharma into advanced therapies and cell therapies, which is super exciting and it makes me believe in our commercial viability. But innovation has got to happen somewhere across that table.
No, I think actually the answer is interesting because it's at two ends of the spectrum. So where you see, there's five big pharma players, that have, or four that have commercial products, one that's had invested heavily in late stage assets. Those that have had experienced the pain firsthand of trying to commercialize a non-scalable process, and whether that was the very first process out the gate or some that were more recent, none of them have scaled easily. There's been billions of dollars to invest in getting those processes to any sort of scale, but the cost of goods continue to be too high. The throughput continues to be too low. The reliability too low, where they know that they can't replicate that. They can't afford to replicate that experience. So they are looking to innovation to help solve the problem. And you saw, J&J just announced a deal with Sailor Origins to look and see if some of the robotics can help. There's some of those big players are partners of Ori's. So I think at that end of the spectrum, people that have experienced firsthand don't want to go through that pain again and are looking to innovation. At the other end of the spectrum, the very earliest programs. So if you think about academic centers, we're partnered with the likes of MD Anderson through the CTMC team, through City of Hope, with Seattle Children's and other leading centers. They have seen it from the other end of the spectrum. They've developed, therapeutic interventions. They've developed platforms that can treat disease that do have, so potentially some clinical data or have demonstrated the potential for safety and efficacy, but they haven't been able to partner those assets. The tech transfer teams at those academic centers have had difficulty in the last 4 or 5 years trying to partner assets that don't demonstrate commercial viability early. Like you might have great science, but big pharma and venture capitalists are not backing companies or buying companies or licensing assets. They can't reach scale. If I can't make money on it, I mean, let's all be very sort of open about pharma development is a very expensive endeavor. Billion, $2 billion, 10 years that you invest to get one product that you hope takes care of the other 90% of failures that happened in your pipeline. You have to be able to deliver a return on investment. And so those early developers, those kind of research institutes, are thinking about commercial viability even at the early research phase. So that was a super interesting finding for us because we expected that to be incredibly hard for us to have conversations with PIs who are looking for a grant than a Nature publication. But I think the business people in some of those organizations are struggling. What's interesting is that middle bit. So it's the biotechs that are already in flight, that have already been funded to some extent, and they are sort of on a trajectory that they can't change. They might realize that their process isn't scalable. They might realize that their cost of goods are going to be too high, but their venture capitalist backers and their boards are still executing the biotech playbook 1.0 from 10 or 15 years ago. Like just get first in man, get data, run, 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 fast, 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 go, 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 not knowing that essentially they're designing to a dead end and there's nothing that they can do about it. They're in this sort of place where they can't sort of decide, okay, we're gonna pivot to a new manufacturing technology now because we've got our investors breathing down our neck, and they're in this impossible position, knowing that potentially the product they're developing isn't going to be commercially viable, but not being able to do anything about it. And that's probably the worst place to be, is in that middle ground.
Yeah. I think that what I've seen out of some development centers is they have, almost a commercial, but more of a manufacturing focused person that's now being added to those teams.
Yes.
Um, and that is critical. I'm not talking about, I mean, the pricing activity early on I mean, we've done pitch decks before. We proposed on businesses. That commercial number is simpler to at least start with to say, here's
Yeah.
what the commercial price of the drug is. On the other hand, that middle piece of how will this become commercially viable isn't just is the science working, but rather does it have a mode for repeatable in commercial manufacturing results. And so I think adding that expertise early and something interesting you said there is that people experience that have felt that pain firsthand. Um, if I'm at a large pharma organization that has acquired a cell therapy asset, just to use that as an example, I almost want to create a tiger team on the side. I want to insulate them from my, big pharma mentality. Not that that's a bad mentality. It is a successful mentality that's protected hundreds of millions of patients out there.
Hmm.
But in a time of innovation, it will stymie innovation. So you almost need like a tiger team of those experienced individuals to look at the assets and go, how would I do this if I had a blank slate? Because the regulators aren't stopping me, right? Not necessarily they're not stopping me. They want to see me succeed in solving this issue.
Yes.
But if I'm going to have an innovation theater occur, um, I need to insulate the theater portion so that innovation can happen. And then on the development side, I need to have these people, these with the firsthand experience, to discuss solving this issue early so that we can get these drugs to patients. So I think the value of those people with firsthand experience to me is very high. And leaders need to identify that because on the early stage, they won't be funded if they don't have that person in house or at least externally partnered to drive that, uh, to drive solving that problem. And on the opposite end, on our larger pharma partners, they need to find something in the house to innovate and stay on the front side. Otherwise, somebody's coming to eat your lunch at a future date and time.
Yeah. No, 100% agree. I think it's also incumbent upon people like you who advise companies and people like us who have innovations in the market that can help to demonstrate the potential value of these things. So, we started out by demonstrating the biological benefit. We can get 2x the cell yield, or we can, improve transduction efficiency or lower COGS, whatever those things are. But the ability to drive standardization, so drive the sort of out of spec rates down from maybe 20% the way they are today to less than 5%. Like that would have an incredible impact on COGS. What about the development timeline? Like based on the data that we've seen and the work we've done with partners, we did a tech transfer with a partner from Houston to Philadelphia to two different sites. We did it in 6 weeks. Doing a tech transfer, you know how hard that is. It takes 9 to 12
Yeah.
months usually because we took a lot of the training burden off because machines are doing some of the work, not all people. It wasn't a full tech transfer. This is a proof of concept. So before everybody starts shouting at me in the comments of this podcast, but just the idea that we could transfer a protocol from across the country from one site to the next. We ran 3 parallel batches in both places using split ingredients, split reagents, etc. And we delivered it all. We demonstrated that all 6 batches could meet the predetermined CQAs by this measured by the same analytical lab. So if we could cut tech transfer even by 3 months, let's say we go from 9 months to 6 months, or 12 months to 6 months, how many times do you tech transfer in the development of an advanced therapy? Twice? 3 times? Saving 18 months on a development process just through faster tech transfer? That's massive. Time is money in drug development. So, it's being able to prove some of these proof points to say, hey, we did this tech transfer with this client and it took that long versus what your expectations are that might help some of those, let's call them fixed frameworks of thinking, open up to new ideas and new innovation.
Yeah. And as we move technology upstream, we can do those items faster because we're reducing the amount of variables in
Yes.
the tech transfer process.
Yes.
And so it's a great point. One thing I've been challenged in thinking about is as I look at the cost models, we're we really need to find ways to improve supply chain to actually reduce the cost of equipment and the disposable technology also because what we're seeing as we analyze the landscape is we're not necessarily decreasing the cost of goods.
Hmm.
We are paying the same, but we're getting consistency, right? So let's not act like there's no benefit to
Yeah.
automation.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the goal is to do both,
Yeah.
to increase, you know. consistency, therefore having better scalability, but furthermore to ultimately reduce COGS. I think that's where we're also burdened right now is how do we solve that equation? Because we're not it's not going getting there as quick as I would like to see it
Yeah.
personally. And I think
Yeah.
that'll be interesting to see how do we solve that.
Yeah. Some of those proof points I hope will be available next year from some of our partners. We see with the investment that you need to make in a Nero instrument and the consumables for one run, you can save still, including those costs, you can save 30 to 50% on your COGS out of the gate. So not only do you get better standardization, lower out of spec rates, higher throughput, but you get cost. You need to have all three. It needs to be better, faster, cheaper, or else you're not getting all the benefits you need. And that's really what we're striving for as we move forward with our partners and getting into the clinic next year. We're coming towards the end of our time together, and thanks again for your time and for visiting with us today. I wondered if you would just to kind of project forward and say, if we're having the same conversation 5 years from now, what are your hopes for what we've accomplished? What's changed in how we deliver cell therapies to patients in that 5 year period?
I hope in 5 years we can look back and say we solved the items that are blocking us from getting this to patients. We have, and when I say solved, I mean progress.
Yeah,
Um, we can get to a lower cost to the patient and take off some of the burden so that we can get the personalized medicine that our body is responding to. And in that way, that would increase education. So, one is I'd like to see cost. Two, better safety profiles. We're still learning, right? And if we can reduce those barriers, whether we move to more of point of care, more an in vivo model, um, I think there's going to be a place for autologous therapy in the future. Period.
absolutely.
Whether allogeneic comes in and disrupts the line of treatment, but there's going to be personalized therapy, in my belief, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so it is our responsibility to continue to drive these changes. Again, as we discussed, moving some of the automation upstream, allowing the freedom for our developers, our scientists to move the technology forward, and then ultimately drive down COGM and continue to work with regulators. And I think we have the right environment for it, but we're gonna need to get some wins. And I always say, we do a lot of capital builds. I can never just change saying, oh, if we would have changed this person or this subcontractor or this piece, look at how this model says we would have finished that product. You don't get that opportunity. You don't get a
No.
second chance at the first bite of an apple. Um, and so we need that entrepreneurial, that solution driven mentality to be early on so that we're not restricting our partners as they develop, but rather partnering with them to make sure that we can actually get this to the patients in need. And I hope that's what we're talking about 5 years from now is that we got more and more of these to the patients in need by overcoming the oncologist, the cost model, the education, and ultimately the automation.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great ambition. I think you've just very effectively described what I'm calling CGT 2.0, which I think is starting now. We've learned those lessons from the first 8 or 10 products that have been improved and the pioneers in the space. And we're looking at, how do we make CGT successful? And I agree that, with a focus on commercial viability early, with bringing automation earlier in the process, focusing on, COGS and line of therapy and patient access alongside safety and efficacy, that we will be able to deliver a new generation of cost-effective therapies that can make it to patients at scale. Because ultimately, what's the point of having cures for cancer? Patients can't get access to them, and that's what we're all trying to do here. And so that's a great ambition, Eli.
And if the past is the best indicator of future, we've done this before.
We have
It's just now we're applying it to new therapies that are life changing and life saving. And that'd be a profound accomplishment for the industry if we could move that all forward because we're changing lives here. And I can't be more thankful to be a part of this industry.
a great note to end on, John. Thanks again for your time today and for all the work you do at Project Pharma, you and your colleagues. And look forward to seeing you again soon, I hope.
You're the best, Jason. Congratulations over you again. Have an awesome day.